I give the floor to Dr. Karim Lainawi, Executive President of the Policy Center for the New South, and I wish you a very pleasant event.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Roberto, and to you. Where are you, Roberto? Okay, always in the first. Great. Thank you, Roberto, for this initiative. We are glad to organize this together, and through you to your colleagues as well, and to Talina to have come. Thanks to Jihad, also, he's not here. It's something we've discussed with him a couple of weeks ago when he was here. And to you, thank you for joining us. I hope we'll have a good discussion. I always say to the team, when you master microphones, is that you're at the steady state of institutions. That's the most complex thing to master, is sound. Engineers know that. Bear with us. We just started, we just moved here a couple of months ago, and we are not mastering sound yet. We used to in our previous offices, so it'll come. Wanted to say a few words about the theme. It's important. There's a very important word there, and I think it's not MENA, it's growth, inclusive growth. It's an issue for many countries around the world, including advanced economies. It has, of course, the word inclusive, which means equity, social safety nets, inclusivity in societies. It goes much beyond economics. It's about the fabrics of nations, of societies. And you are all well aware, of course, of the complex and challenging framework, environment that we are all facing. Fragmentations, competition, rivalries. It's becoming impossible to congregate among us economists without very soon in the debate getting into political and international politics. So I think these are some issues we will be discussing. There's no autonomy of topics, and I think it's a good news, by the way, for economies that have tended to sort of narrow their thinking, particularly during the heydays of globalization. So here at the Policy Center, we are looking at the world from the New South, not the Global South, the New South, which is an engaged South with values, that is engaging the world with tolerance, openness, and particularly for us here, of course, with the grounded in academia and fact-based policy analysis. It's very important. You are not in a think tank that does advocacy, but a think tank that has a strong intellectual grounds and passion, but also the capacity to transcript. And I hope that we will touch upon those issues here in this panel and in the afternoon. Digestible ideas of policies, of new ways of doing things, of new ways of including the broader population, the younger generations, for a better MENA, of course, that has its specific challenges, but I think for the world in general. And that is for us what we try to do, and I'm very pleased to see the IMF venturing in these topics. Really the word is venturing. The IMF I knew when I was at the central bank was more classical, which is great. Something that has resisted the use of the time is something that is carrying its own proof in a way of relevance. And I think we still need a strong IMF that does balance of payment support, that can provide emergency liquidity lines to countries. It remains a fundamental role, but it is important to broaden the scope of macroeconomic policies and to include it in the end on more longer structural issues which are not possible to delink in fact. So I would like to thank also my friend Ibrahim. Hello Ibrahim, thanks for being here. I wish I hope we can have you soon here on campus, and also Ziad Bahaldin also for joining us online. I know it's very less comfortable for you than for us, so thank you for your patience and for being with us. I think it's an important thing to have you. Also, you bring a very interesting perspective, which is a more Mashreq perspective, which is important for us to hear here in the Maghreb region. Thank you, Noor, also for being with us. So I handle you the panel, and as you see, the style of the Policy Center is being nice but being tough at the same time, but I'm sure that you know how to do this very well and actually better than us. So I have a nice day, looking forward to exchange with you during the days. It is a way also for us to talk about future partnerships, new ideas, etc. In the end, we're all in the business of ideas, relevant ideas for good policies, for the benefit of our citizens all around the region. Many thanks again for being here.
I give the floor to Dr. Talin Kouranchelian, Deputy Director of the Middle East and Central Asian Department, the IMF, for the second opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Let me see, I can master this. It's okay?
Don't worry if you want it. Sabotage you.
All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion on a very important topic for the IMF, which is the inclusive growth in the Middle East and North Africa. As my colleague Karim was mentioning, this is organized jointly by the Policy Center for the New South and the IMF. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Policy Center for hosting this discussion, but also more broadly for their close collaboration with us, including in the preparation of this year's annual meetings. As you may know, okay, now I can hear myself. As you may know, this year's annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF will take place in Marrakesh later in October, and they will mark the return of these meetings to Africa after 50 years and to the Arab world after 20 years. So these are going to be important milestones for the IMF, for Morocco, and for the region, and they will present an opportunity to foster dialogue and create a momentum on the key challenges and priorities facing the global economy. For the MENA region, one theme that we would like to bring to the fore at our discussions in Marrakesh is how to renew our collective efforts to ensure that the benefits of economic development accrue more equally to all citizens. Indeed, 10 years ago, we had the Arab Springs, and at that time, the need to ensure more and fairer opportunities for all was at the forefront, and it still remains a key priority for MENA countries. Among the main issues that are still unresolved is the high unemployment of the youth particularly, which is at 25%, probably twice as much as in other regions, the large gap in economic opportunities for women, the fragmented social protection systems, the dominant role of the public sector, and in contrast, the underdeveloped role of the private sector, which is facing tight regulations and administrative constraints and probably unlimited access to credit. Now,
Addressing these issues will require important policy choices and trade-offs. For example, if we think about the demand for social protections after the multiple shocks that have hit the world economy and the region, they likely run up against the macroeconomic constraints that are in many economies in the MENA. And satisfying these needs in the face of a narrower policy space means that it will be unavoidable to rethink about the role of the state in the MENA region, from being the primary provider of jobs, goods, and services to being the provider of opportunities. We at the IMF followed these issues closely over the last decade. We organized 2 regional conferences, one in Amman in 2014 and one in Marrakesh in 2018, with the ambition to advance this discussion and to see what policies can unlock MENA's potential growth, exploit new sources of growth, promote entrepreneurship, transparency, technology, and scale up opportunities for women and youth. And last November, we have also published a book that examines these long-standing issues together with new challenges like those arising from the climate change or the automation and artificial intelligence on production processes and the labor market. Despite the wealth of analysis and the widespread consensus on the diagnosis, as well as our continuous policy dialogue with our members, the search for policy solutions remained elusive in many MENA economies. Only a few countries, including Morocco, announced a series of deep transformative reforms that would bring about a new model of development. So our objective today is to revisit the inclusive growth agenda in the MENA region, taking stocks of the key gaps in participation and opportunities, and candidly discussing the reasons why progress remains so hard to achieve. Are we missing any particularly important dimension of this problem? How can we better internalize the political economy challenges associated with making growth more inclusive in the region? And how should we frame the debate in the years to come, build the necessary constituency, and help policymakers advance in closing these gaps? I'm sure today's discussion will help us advance in answering these questions and prepare for the dialogue we want to have in Marrakesh in October. Let me stop here. Thank you very much, and looking forward to hearing today's exchange.
Thank you, Mrs. Now, let me see if this is working. Is it working? No. Okay. Let me try again. Now? Yes. All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. We would like to welcome you to this discussion. As it has been mentioned, this is a collaboration between the Policy Center of the New South and the International Monetary Fund. Our discussion today will be about inclusive growth. Mrs. Kornashelian described today's discussion fairly well. We will try to talk about the impediments to inclusive growth. We will try to touch upon the different policy measures that are needed at this point, what can be done, what has been done, and what has not been done properly or needs more development. Please allow me to briefly introduce myself. My name is Noor Ammashi. I work as a business and news anchor at Al-Sharq Business with Bloomberg. I present a daily business and news show that covers equity markets, bond markets in the GCC, in the MENA region, and globally. And we cover also the commodity markets, oil and gas, forex, crypto, and all that has to do with markets and the economy. I've been doing this for several years now. I hold a master's degree in public policy from Northwestern University in Chicago. I studied at the American University of Beirut, where Mr. Bahout comes from today. and I will briefly introduce our panelists, our guests today. Let me start with Ms. Lina. I will just mention the brief description about what each one of the esteemed guests do, because their CV is quite long and rich with a lot of experience. Ms. Lina Khatib, okay, oops, it's on the second page. I think it's by alphabetical order here. Okay, so Ms. Lina Khatib is the director of the SOAS, University Middle East Institute, the School of Oriental and African Studies Institute. Okay, all right. And okay, before becoming the director of the SOAS, you directed policy research programs at some of the world's leading policy institutes, and you have served as the director of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Chatham House and the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I hope I have given you the correct description. If there's anything you would like to add. Okay, Dr. Bahout is the director of the Issam Faris Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, where I have happened to work for some time, long time ago. I'm quite old. And he holds a PhD in economics, professor at Sciences Po Paris, and you are a consultant to the policy planning unit at the Unity of the French Ministry of Financial Affairs, and currently you are an associate professor of practice in the PSPA, Political Science and Public Administration Department at the American University of Beirut. Okay, so we've got a lot of people on this paper here. Dr. Jaidi is a professor and senior fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, and you are a member of its editorial and research oversight steering committee, and you are an affiliate professor at the Faculty of Governance, Economics and Social Sciences at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University. And our esteemed guests who are joining us virtually today, we have become really accustomed to virtual meetings during COVID days. It has become a natural thing to do. Mr. Brahim, I'm sorry, Dr. Brahim. ما كاتبين لي كون PhD. Let me double check. It's not mentioned, the PhD. I really apologize. Okay, Mr. Ziad Bahauddin, former Prime Minister of Economic Development and Minister of International Cooperation. Dr. Bahauddin is an Egyptian lawyer and an expert on financial law, investment and company laws, governance, compliance, and economic legislation. And currently, he is the managing partner at the Thebes Consultancy and the non-executive member on several companies. And last but not least, definitely is Mr. Brahim Al-Badawi, the managing director at the Economic Research Forum. You've been there since January 2017, and Minister of Finance and Economic Planning at the in Sudan. Previously to that, you are a professor emeritus at University of Khartoum. I hope I have presented our esteemed guests as quickly as possible, and I have given you good background about our guests today. And regarding our discussion, let me pick up this. So as it has been mentioned, today we will be discussing the different policy measures that are needed to facilitate inclusive growth. We will touch upon all the different measures that have been taken and what is still needed at this point. And let's start our discussion with Mr. Bahout. So it's been mentioned that it's been a decade since the Arab Spring. Several countries in the region were able to successfully take steps to achieve inclusive growth, well, yet still some are lagging behind. At this point, in your view, Dr. Bahout, where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities? How have they changed over the past decade? What opportunities have been missed in your view, from your perspective?
Okay, thank you. Thank you first for the IMF and for, is it working well? Okay, thank you for the IMF, represented here by a very old and dear friend, Taline. And thank you for also my good friend Jihad Azrour, who can't be here. And thank you very much for the PCNS and Karim for hosting us here. And I hope that this will be the first ring of a series of other meetings around a very sensitive and a very timely issue. It's very timely, and also I'm very happy that you put your question in the context of 10 years or more after the Arab Spring, because this is exactly where probably I will have a reaction to your question. I'm very partly an economist. I'm more a political scientist. By the way, my PhD is in political science, not in economics, but this is not a problem. So I will tend to have more of a political approach or a political economy approach to answer your question. What are we discussing here exactly? We are discussing the question of how inclusive is growth in the MENA region. Okay, we can approach this question with a purely technical macroeconomic, let's say, lens or paradigm, and say, okay, we have to make sure that the benefits or the dividends of growth and economic development are more equally shared among segments, classes, if you want to talk about a concept that is now out-fashioned, unfortunately, genders, youth, etc., etc. How deep and how wide is the distribution of growth dividends? All this is, this discussion in the Arab world, in the MENA region, is also happening within a set of constraints, of very dire constraints. First of all, of course, the global question of climate and global warming, the question of demographics, which is, I think, a particular question in the Middle East, a very pressing question in the Middle East. I read the IMF report on this question, and the figures are quite alarming. In the coming decade, we will have something like 100 million persons flowing on the job market, on the labor market. So this is a huge challenge. We have, of course, some, I would say, ergonomic constraints that have popped up also with the post-COVID era, the way it has altered and changed the way we work and the way we approach and we tackle issues of employment. And of course now artificial intelligence, automation, which is, by the way, and this is maybe part of the discussion, both a challenge but also an opportunity for the creation of jobs and etc. Now the challenges ahead, of course, I'm still here on the technical, quote-unquote technical, of course, macroeconomic approach. The challenges to answer or to take or to cope with are issues like decarbonation, green growth, green economy, etc., etc., with a question I think that we will maybe tackle in our discussion or later on about the post-oil rent economies that is developing in certain areas, mainly in the Gulf area. Another challenge is, and you said it, we'll probably touch upon it also later on more in depth, is the question of the balance, and Taline mentioned this or alluded to that, the balance, the proper balance between private and public sector, and how to get out of, grossly speaking, what has been known as a crony capitalist system in the MENA region. The question of the educational system, which for me is a crucial question, and it's not a technical question, it's a philosophical question. How to train new generations not only to master a certain set of skills and competences, but also philosophically to approach the world in a different manner, in a much more critical thinking, in a much more creative, and etc. And all this leads me to starting to get out of the purely economic approach to get into a more political approach. Another challenge is also the public space and its closedness, and the geopolitical context of today with the war in Ukraine, with, of course, the rise of global powers that are not, and I think that we have to start thinking seriously about that, that are not sharing the same sets of liberal values that, for example, an institution like the IMF is embedded into. Emerging global powers today do not share exactly the same worldview, the same economic view, the same values on which the model of liberal economy is fundamentally based, and this is something that we have to think of. This leads me, and I will stop here probably, to say that in fact all this means, if you boil it down to something, it means that if we have to answer the challenge of how to get more inclusive in the growth and the sharing of the dividends of growth and development, I think that it's now time to really understand and acknowledge that we have to revise very deeply the social and political contract in the MENA region. So it's a governance issue. It's much more than a technical issue, it's a governance issue. Why am I happy that you started your question by putting it in the framework of the Arab revolutions or what happened in the Arab region for the last decade? It's because I think, and it's something that we have now to face with the end of this cycle of Arab revolutions, that in fact most of the governance issues that were blown up by the triggering of these revolutions are still on the table, and they are still unanswered on the table. And I think this is the main conundrum that political actors, that civil societies, and that international organizations like the IMF have to tackle with and recognize. We have to admit that this cycle opened up the real questions in the Arab world, governance issues, freedom of speech, public space openness, integration of new segments, educational transformation leading to something more open and more critical, etc., etc. All this have been not only not answered, but it has been crushed again by today what we have to admit as being the victory in a way or another of the restoration of an old order that probably very largely led to the set of problems that we are facing today. So what I'm saying here, and I'll end up on that note, is that not only we are not solving the real issues that are impeding the distribution of growth, the distribution of benefits and the equal access to growth and benefits and dividends and etc., but we are probably getting a step back. I think that unfortunately, and this is my grim reading of the region, of the MENA region, is that yes, despite some very bright and very brilliant aspects of growth, I'm thinking of the modernization in some Gulf states, probably also the modernization or the growth in other parts of the MENA region. Unfortunately, for the rest, I think that there is a sort of setback, there is a sort of one step behind, and that these crucial questions will still be on the table and will probably blow up again in the coming period. And this is why I think this is where institutions like the IMF, but also us as think tanks and intellectual and academics have to really focus our attention in order to avoid the new explosion in a very bloody manner of questions that are remaining unanswered, that are partly economic and technical and etc., but that are very largely political and led or related to governance or the lack thereof. I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bahout, for this input. Let's move to Dr. Ziad Bahauddin. So Dr. Bahout discussed the opportunities, the missed opportunities, the nature of the problem. He discussed the political nature of many of those problems currently. If we want to talk about the reforms that have been made over the past decade, would we say that those reforms were ill-designed, poorly implemented, not well designed to meet the needs of the countries? Where is the problem with all the reforms that have been made, that have been taken as laws in some Arab countries, or in some countries in the MENA region, to be specific?
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we could.
Okay, very good.
Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Greetings from Cairo. And thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you here today. And I want to start by congratulating our friends in Morocco for hosting the event forthcoming. And really, it's a source of delight and pride for all of us in the Arab world and in Africa that this is taking place on Moroccan ground. And really hope all the best and all the success. So to get into the subject directly, I have a few points to make on your question and on the panel in general. And I'll be brief. The first one is, we talk here about renewal the dialogue. And for us to renew the dialogue, I think we need to be very clear about what went right and what went wrong. And I also commend the publication that was issued last year. It's a very good, not just a start, it's a very good outcome, but also I think much more needs to be done on understanding where things were and what has been achieved. I want to particularly stop at something that I always object to in the opening statement, actually, where there is the issue of the shocks that have happened as a result of COVID first and then of the Ukrainian war. All true. Of course, the shocks were enormous. We're still living in their impact. But I am very careful to point out that we need to see what was right and wrong about economic and social policies prior to those two shocks, because we don't want them to become a smoke screen that hides what has been going on before, and therefore whether the policies adopted prior to these two undoubtedly big shocks were the right ones and would have been sustainable and positive if this hadn't happened. The next point I have is that, and I'm saying something obvious here perhaps, but with some repercussions, I hope, is that we also have to be very clear about where some progress has been made and where it has not been made, and where actually things might have even slipped back. So we are talking, obviously, all of us, about a variety of important policy areas and measurements. So gender equality, social protection, youth empowerment, generational gap. And here I think the difference in the state of affairs is enormous. I can perhaps point out to Egypt, for example, where I think that there has been a lot of advancement on the gender equality issue, some important social protection programs, but I think the generational gap and the income and welfare gap continues to be quite enormous. So we need to know, what are we talking about? What are the areas of priorities? Where has there been success and where there has been perhaps a decline? And one of the important things to consider here is to also use a parameter or a metric, to use a metric, which is where the deficiency has been in resources, so where more money basically would have made a better outcome, and where the gap has been due to lack of policies. Because this impacts the future. So whether there are programs that are good in themselves, but they just need more resources, and where there is no program or no right program in place, and therefore a much more a redirection of economic and social policy needs to take place. The third thing I want to point out to is that we often use the measurement of poverty, and it's obviously a very important one, because this is undoubtedly the strongest measurement of whether social protection and social progress and social equality is taking place. But I'm increasingly inclined to also use a term that is now much more used in IMF, World Bank, and other international organizations literature, which is vulnerability. I find that talking about the level of vulnerability at least as important as that of poverty, because it reflects something much more dynamic, it reflects a very large segment of particularly young people. I don't know, I cannot say with some level of assertion if there is a gender dimension to it, but certainly a particularly large number of young people who will be at various times in their lives earning enough income to be above the poverty line and to be perhaps even in the lower middle class segment, but who with sudden economic, political, geographical shifts can find themselves completely out of income, no protection, no nothing at all, no even legal recourse on employment or on social insurance or any of that. So I think we have to measure inclusive growth by how much it reduces poverty, certainly, but how much it hedges against and it mitigates against the vulnerability in which a lot of young people find themselves.
Dr. Bahauddin, I want to really thank you for this point that you've brought up about this parameter that should measure whether the policies are there or if the policies are not there, but if it's a matter of resources or of designing policies. This is a good point to bring up. And I also would like to touch upon the point that Dr. Bahauddin made about vulnerability. This is really important and crucial point to be discussed at this level, because the policies to probably increase GDP growth, the policies to increase the investment in education, they have become well known. I mean, everyone knows what should be done to increase the level of investments in education, in the health care systems, and so on. But how do we hedge against vulnerability? This is a really important point that Dr. Bahauddin brought up. And probably I'll take it from there to Dr. Al-Badawi and discuss what can be done in the short term. So what we've been discussing so far are good targets, but this is for the longer term. They take time to manifest. For the shorter term, what could be done to facilitate the least possible of inclusive growth until the longer term goals can be reached?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. I would also like to extend my thanks and appreciation to the Policy Center for the New South and as well as the IMF for this partnership. And I would also like to say that from our perspective as Economic Research Forum for the Middle East and North Africa, the ERF, of course, we very much involved in this type of partnership and playing host to reports from both the IMF and the World Bank. And I think this is very important development because it allows the region to have a voice and to engage in a serious dialogue with the multilateral development institutions. So without further ado, let me delve into the question. And I would like to, as a general matter of characterization of reform, I would like to say that in the short run, a very important intervention that's not directly reform, but very important to motivate reform, is to initiate a national narrative about what needs to be done as a society and societies in the region, and that actually economic reform is a political process, because economic reform entails winners and losers, and potentially all winners in the future. So in the short run, the process is really about winners and losers. So there is a need actually to develop a communication strategy, if you will, in order to convey the political aspects of economic reforms, especially now in the context of the major macroeconomic crisis of sluggish growth and debt overhang, and of course, thinking about the future, the impending digital revolution and what it entails in terms of automation and artificial intelligence. And of course, the region is particularly vulnerable to the climate change and the consequences of climate change. So I think there is need for a national developmental economic narrative that is deeply political. All aspects of, all elements of society should be involved in it. In this context, I think, just to articulate this point, oftentimes the middle class in our countries, they complain about that they are the main, base for the tax, for the tax system. Yet, public, social service delivery in education and health are not for the quality that they can actually depend upon. And so there is an important consideration is to engage the middle class. And in this context, I want to zero on a very important policy reform that we were forced to do, or the authorities were forced to do in the context of the COVID-19 and the more recent war on Ukraine, which was social protection. I think this is an important consideration that, or policy, that deeply political requires, cooperation and support from certain elements of society, especially the urban middle class, is not to claim a right for subsidized commodities, especially fuel subsidies. We know all very well that actually in all of these countries in North Africa and the Middle East, almost all of them, fuel subsidies actually in particular, oftentimes account or used to account for more than the combined resource allocated in the budget to education and health. And this is actually a blueprint for disaster, not just for the current generations, but also for future generation, forfeiting the future of the future the welfare of the future generation. So therefore, I think in the short run, social protection, especially through digitally enabled cash transfers, is a very critical instrument that has been, I think, implemented by necessity as a result of the COVID-19 and the more recent crisis, cyclical crisis. So I think this is an important consideration, not only because it provides access to basic necessities such as food to the many of the poor. And in many countries, building on what Dr. Bahauddin said, is that Ziad Bahauddin said, is that actually a large segment of the society are bunched around the poverty line. So we have a situation where a large number of the poor, or the larger number of the poor, are very close to the poverty line, and then below the poverty line, and those above the poverty line are not far from the poverty line. So when a cyclical shock happens, then actually the poor will become, acutely poor. So the depths of poverty become very severe, and those who were non-poor, they become poor. So it's very important in the short run, especially in response to these kind of shocks, to think about the state as a provider of social protection. And that's very important. In order to make room for that, certainly we need the cooperation of the middle class, because they are very powerful, especially the urban middle class, as actors in the political marketplace. So it's very important to do that in a context of a debate. And also to try as much as possible to promote the role of the state as a regulator, to regulate the services of the private sector in education and health. In many of our countries, the cost of service delivery in education and health by the private sector has been a runaway, has been very expensive, and in many cases could not be justified. And so this entails a very important role for the public sector to act as a regulator, as well as to try to improve its own service delivery in public hospitals and public schools. So more or less, these are some issues associated with short-term reforms that are important by necessity, but they could also motivate longer-term structural transformation and much deeper reform in the medium to longer run. So I stop here.
Well, this is a really also important point you've touched upon, Dr. Ibrahim. So Dr. Ibrahim is talking about initiating a national narrative that has winners that would convince the public, the population, that any reform taken would have winners and losers. But how can we communicate this to the population, to the public, in a way that is fact-based, that in a way that would not promote or that would not cause a lot of discontent from the populations, just like we've had in many cases in several economies. I would not really want to go into the details of that, but in any country that we've had an IMF program, we have had some discontent from parts of society, whether it was Egypt, whether it's Tunis, Lebanon, Sudan as well. And usually those programs have to be more or less tough. They're not a stroll in the park, but short-term reforms are usually tough when it comes to facilitating growth in the long run. It requires tough measures in the short run. How can we communicate, Ms. Lina, this concept to the populations in a way that they would understand that all of this is fact-based and that this is necessary in order to move forward with growth, with inclusive growth?
Okay, this is working, right? Okay, thanks. There's a note that I just want to make before proceeding, and I'm not making it because I have an ego. But when you have a panel with 4 men and only 1 woman speaking, and you exclusively refer to doctors, even when I alerted you that I'm also doctor, you still call me miss. It's not about ego. We're talking about inclusive growth.
My apologies, but
we're talking about inclusive growth. This is the kind of thing that I see very, very often, unfortunately. The kinds of things that slip through the net because we just don't pay attention and take them for granted. It's, you know, unfortunately quite ingrained. So I have to make a note of that. It is important when we talk about dealing with citizens to kind of be mindful of unconscious bias. And when it comes to your question about citizens and how, you know, country politicians and leaders can inform them in a way that is not about disinformation, well, I think the burden here is really primarily on governance, the governments themselves, and have they put in place policies that first encourage their citizens to engage in critical thinking? Have they put in place policies that encourage transparency, accountability? How can you blame the citizens for being mistrustful when the system itself is built on lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and bad governance? Unfortunately, across the region, we see these problems manifest themselves. And so to kind of say the government needs to get the citizen on board, well, the citizen needs to be very well informed, but also trusted. And this is something that I've recently taken on as a cause. We talk a lot about getting the citizen to trust the state. But what about the state trusting the citizen? In many cases, unfortunately, citizens are treated as if they are a burden or an opponent of state leaders. We see this, unfortunately, in contexts like Lebanon, I will say, where the needs of the citizen are completely ignored. It's as if the citizens are a burden on the governance system in the country, as this shouldn't be the case. There has to be a social contract that is based on mutual trust and cooperation. The other issue is when you have this mistrust by the leaders, then you're casting the citizen as a kind of afterthought. And this is where people start thinking that any growth policy is actually meant to line the pockets of those in charge. And so again, to change that, you need measures of good governance in place. So it all goes back to good governance. I think this is a huge, still unfortunately, issue in the region that many countries still need to work on. So before we talk about this information, let's go back to the basics of good governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lina, but I would like to extend my apologies, but the biography here did not mention that you've earned a PhD, which I'm sure you are a perfect professor, but so it slipped from me, and this is why it's mentioned here, Miss Lina. So this is, I would like to extend my warmest apologies to you. Dr. Jaidi, if we want to talk about the winners and losers out of all policies that are taken by governments, what can be done to avoid rent-seeking, to avoid hindering those reform efforts in the easiest possible way until we can establish a more advanced restructuring of the economies, of the governance?
Okay, thank you. I think that the MENA region is an economically and politically diverse. And clearly, there are risks in making generalization about the growth performance or the inclusive economy. Because each of the 25 countries or economies had its own experience. But differences arise between countries that undertook deep reforms and countries where there is a loss or there is less vigorous reforms. I think that I can focus on the main common features in the region. And I will focus on 4 or 5 points. The first, in my opinion, what are the main factors shaping the political economy of reform? In my opinion, there is 3 main factors. The first is the authoritarian political systems. And it is widely recognized that the economic reforms depend on the nature of political system. And the progress in reforms is linked to democratic institutions. Political regimes in the region are mostly autocratic. And this is critical for the process of reform, in designing and the implementation of reforms. And the second factor is the persistence of conflict and violence in the region. I think that regional security concerns and conflict are frequently used to justify the slow pace of both economic and political reform. And in addition, you have many tensions between all the countries in the region. And the persistence on the conflict and security concerns affect negatively reforms in three ways. First, they divert resources to military and security spending. The second, they increase risk aversion to reforms. And third, the existence of open and or potential conflict justifies the maintaining of direct control over assets as well as other economic levels. And the third factor is the nature of the economies and the low structural transformation of the economies. We are in different varieties of rent economies. And these rent economies, the role of distribution is to gain social peace and not to include the population and the participation of population in the decision. So, in this picture, what are the loser and the beneficiary of this context? I think that those who benefit from rents and the statu quo, and for which rents could be lost, tend to be well organized, well politically organized, and they have access to voice and decision. But in contrast, those groups who might benefit from reform are generally disappear. And they have a weaker capacity to defend their interests or their position. So I think that it is this situation is linked to weak democratic institutions. Generally, in a process of reform, the most important lobby for reform is the private sector. But in this region, in the MENA region, the private sector is very weak, is not autonomous, is not well organized. And it negotiates its interests with the administration, the bureaucracy, or the political system, and rather than push to radical change. Trade unions in this region are very weak in their capacity to negotiate the transformation. And also the regional elites in our countries have not the capacity to negotiate with central power, more power to this region or autonomy to this region. So I think that there are the picture, social picture, where we have many losers in this process of reform. And the third point, I think that the political fragmentation in our countries, in the region, hampered the development of the democratic institution. The demarcation between the public and private sector is not clear in these countries. And the political fragmentation and authoritarian rule have hampered the development of democratic institutions. Civil society organizations, such as professional association, or the non-official media, or the autonomous no-governmental entities, tend to be weak and are often co-opted by governments. And the other point, I think the fourth point, is that you have a double concentration of power in this region. A concentration in assets and wealth, and a concentration in political system. So this situation is not in favor of the opening of the system and the large participation of society or civil society in the decision. And the last point is the fragility of citizen and state relation. You have not a real social pact negotiated and arranged with the clear position and entity with all the stakeholders. So I think that in this context, MENA policymakers must launch a new governance reform, and there are many challenges on this way, on this path. The first challenge will be to build the capacity of large self-serving bureaucracy to respond more effectively to the process of reform, in designing reform and implementing reform. And the second point, I think, or the second challenge, will be to win citizens themselves of public benefits and subsidies, and to create an environment in favor of integration in the decision and in the employers. And the third challenge is to limit the insatiable rent sinking in these countries or in this region. And the fourth and last challenge, in my opinion, will be to create space, a large space, for real political and civil and civic participation.
Great points, Dr. Jaidi. I will proceed to Dr. Bahout. Dr. Jaidi discussed how reforms depend on the nature of the political systems and the economic models, the economic structures in the different countries in the MENA region, and how the fragmentation that we have, the political fragmentation as per se, has had a dire effect that has hampered development of democratic institutions, and this in effect has a big hindrance on the private sector developing in a constructive way. From this perspective, Dr. Bahout, how can we improve those reforms, the competitiveness that those reforms can present to the societies? How can we make sure that governance is well implemented or well addressed through those reforms?
Okay. In fact, actually, I'm quite happy because the discussion, in fact, in a way went in the direction that I was hinting at in my introductory remarks, that the question and the debate, I'm very happy that I hear you and others, that the question is profoundly, at some point, it becomes political, it's not technical. And this is where we reach a sort of deadlock in a way or another, because, of course, we said that 10 years after probably one of the most important upheavals in the Arab region, since maybe the end of the 19th century, the Nahda period and etc., answers are still not there. Okay, fine. Now we agree on this. Now your question is about, okay, given this situation, how can we improve things and how can we make sure that dividends are more widely shared? This is about what we called, I like this expression because it comes from sport, leveling the play field. Okay, how do we level the play? Here again, we have a blend of answers that are partly technical and economic, partly legal also, but mainly are political, because ultimately the decision is political and the outcome is political. And as you said, and I fully agree, ultimately it's a matter of winners and losers. And winners and losers is a political game. People will lose privileges, positions, sometimes power, of course part of wealth, and this is something that usually people don't like to lose. Okay, now, what are the, if I want to list a series of things that could lead to the leveling of the playing field? Of course you have, which is a basic, thing for macroeconomists, we have to eliminate as much as possible, or at least narrow the margins of distortions in all the markets, in several markets. In the job markets, we talked about it, access to jobs by women, gender issues, by youth, by maybe differently skilled labor, etc. Narrowing also the distortions on the money market. We talked about it. It's very crucial, the access to credit. Not only the access to credit, but bank literacy. I give you one example. In Lebanon now, with the crisis that we have all of a sudden discovered that, in fact, 70% of people don't have a bank account. So, okay, we talk about access to banking, access to finance, but this is something that does not exist. So we have all this. Access to credit for businesses, but also for households, for individuals, etc., etc. The second aspect, which is also technical in appearance, is the widening of the social protection system, rendering it more accessible. People also who are not in the formal labor market are not registered in the safety net networks. I mean, they are not perceived by the safety net system, rendering it more cost-effective, more wide-reaching in terms of education, housing, health, etc., etc. And then the last technical, before moving to the political, the last technical, but which starts to be political, is also ameliorating or upgrading or revising the fiscal capacity of the state, meaning revising also the fiscal space. And this is where we touch the political issue. We know, all of us, I mean, the political philosophical underpinning of what democracy is the famous British Revolution sentence, no taxation without representation. When you want to widen, to enlarge the fiscal space, you have to give people, and Lina talked about it, you have to give people more rights, not only right to access food and health and etc., but right to speak out. Okay, and this is where we start to get into the political aspect of leveling the play field. Here we get into things like, for example, when we talk about private, public, and etc., it's the access to information. How are the tenders made? What are the public markets regulation? Who knows about something? Even the private sector, and here maybe I will add a nuance, the private sector is not always or only weak, but it is sometimes accomplice to the private sector or to the crony capitalism. States are creating their own private sector, and this is not a real private sector. So you have to enlarge the information, access to enter to firm creation, etc., etc. Then you have, which comes with it, the legal system. I mean, rule of law, more transparency in tribunals, legal frameworks. We know that most of investments in the MENA region are impeded because people are not sure how will their conflicts, if they happen, will be treated by courts. Which legislations will apply? Local, international, arbitrage, etc., etc. And this is also something of a problem. And then you have, of course, the problem of the crony capitalism, as we said, meaning that, in fact, most of private enterprises are, in fact, in a way or another, controlled by members of the political class. Here again, I could give a Lebanese example. With the crisis, we are increasingly discovering that, in fact, 90% of the banks in Lebanon are directly or indirectly held and owned in terms of shares and etc. by the same political system that is refusing or impeding economic reforms. So it's very nice when the IMF comes to Lebanon and say, we have to get into a bank restructuring in order to solve the collapse of the country, but the same people who will vote on the bank restructuring or who will decide on the bank restructuring are the people who own the bank that they don't want to be restructured because they will lose their advantages. So if we don't see that, we will continue to circle in the same vicious cycle of saying, okay, let's solve a technical problem. Let's create a law. Let's create a regulation and etc. First of all, who will create it, who will implement it, and who will be accountable for using it or for abusing it. So this is where we get back fundamentally to the political question, to the governance system, and to the social pact issue. Thank you.
Well, I would like to take from what Dr. Bahout discussed about the private sector. I would call it a disguised private sector. And I will take this topic to Dr. Bahauddin. If we want to talk about the disguised private sector, as I have coined this term now, in a recent Financial Times article, I would quote, you said the need is to transform the minority of successful Egyptian companies into an overwhelming majority. Today, as we discuss the Egyptian economy, we know that one of the reforms requested by the IMF is to privatize many of the public companies, and in different ways, either selling shares or through IPOs in the stock market and so forth. And we have been reading and following all of this discussion recently, and a lot of hurdles have come up in this aspect to many different reasons. How can we make the private sector more successful, more accountable? How can it be held accountable to managing the important businesses for the society that are currently in the Egyptian story, that are currently held by the public sector, by the companies managed by the army and all the public sector, different institutions? How can we make private sector more successful?
Thank you. And this is, it's a bit of perhaps a departure from the issue of inclusive growth, but I'll try to respond to you and to
about the private sector in particular, so that we do not digress a lot. You're right. It's just about
no, it's okay. It's okay.
Enhancing the private sector. We're discussing about public versus private here.
Sure. I'll start from perhaps a point where we can bring the two issues closer. And that is to say that obviously, and I'm really saying something else obvious here, we cannot talk much about inclusive growth if there is no growth, right? So we have to continue to also want to derive growth and economic development. And that shouldn't be secondary. It is quite primary, in fact. And then, so the issues of efficiency of the economy, of best use of resources, of driving higher productivity are all extremely relevant to inclusive growth. And part of this, of course, or at the center of this is private sector, no doubt about it. And as you have pointed out, we have been in a debate about the role of the state in the economy for quite some time. Having said this, it's important to put this in context, because there's been, I have personally written a lot in the last few years suggesting that the state shouldn't get more and more involved. But I also want to put it in context. One, this is not a new phenomenon in Egypt. We have been struggling with this issue since the 1960s, at least. So it's like something that comes and goes, or actually doesn't go. It comes and then it recedes a little bit, but it's an old phenomenon, not a new one. Number two, I have to place myself in this debate. I'm personally not somebody who's for the so-called total exit of the state from the economy. I think it's an idea that is not attainable, not useful, and some level of presence of state in the economy is actually required. The problem is about competitiveness. The problem is to ensure that the state's involvement does not hamper the private sector from being able to act independently and competitively. And that is why, as much as I would like to see the privatization of some of the state-owned companies, it's extremely important that we don't get totally fixated on this measurement alone, so that whether Egypt is progressing on the right track or not becomes measured only by how many companies we have privatized, because we have to keep our eye on the more important issue, which is ensuring a level playing field, as you've heard, ensuring that a new company can step in with no problem, ensuring a competitive environment. So let's talk about competitiveness in general. One aspect of this is the state selling some of its assets, but we have to know that this is not a target in itself. You do it to ensure that there is competitiveness, and not just to tick a box of 4 out of 32 promised companies have been privatized or not. Because if we do privatize 4 or 5 companies and the competitive environment does not change, then you're only talking about some additional resources in the state's budget.
Then we're talking about something similar to what Dr. Bahout brought up. Private banks turned out to be owned directly or indirectly by people in the public sector, people in government. So it would be, again, a disguised private sector. So Dr. Brahim, if we want to talk about how we can do this balance between the private and the public sector, as Dr. Ziad just recently said, the aim is not just to privatize, the aim is to improve inclusive growth from or through this privatization. How can we do this balance? Through probably some success stories that we could think of. You're on mute, Dr. Brahim, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, the COVID-19 shock, I think, abundantly, made it abundantly clear that the state has a very important role to play as a provider of, or at least as facilitator of social services. And I think this is very important to build upon it in terms of defining a role for the state, especially taking into account the impending automation and digital revolution in general and the consequences for the structure of economies. So the emerging structure of the economy is such that historically development and creation of jobs and the role of the state was to promote hardcore manufacturing, and manufacturing was seen as a provider of productivity, a base for productivity, and also provider of large scale job opportunities. The evidence that is coming now from firm level research and growth is that this is no longer going to be the case in a few years from now. And so any growth strategy that the state should design should also be inextricably linked to the social agenda, social protection in particular, but also education and health. So therefore, I think this will define an emerging role for the state as the state to focus on generating enough resources, which means that fiscal effort has to be jacked up, significantly enhanced, which takes us back to the issue of engagement with the business community and the middle class as provider of public resources for the state. So that actually the state can fulfill its function. But then on the other hand, also, of course, the state has to ensure that the private sector is sufficiently enabled to generate wealth, especially productivity-driven wealth, and to partake into the promises of the new technology in terms of creating a harmony between the tech revolution and also the skills that can actually benefit from this transformation. Also, of course, in the region, we do have the climate change, the imperative of the climate change, and the green growth and green finance. All of these will create considerable challenges, but also opportunities for the public sector to redefine itself and to reposition itself as a regulator and as a provider of social services and protection, and also as efficient, resource mobilizer, especially domestic resource mobilization. This would be a very critical role for the state. Another, I think, role for the state which should be important is industrial policy. There is now a need for a new version of industrial policy rather than just subsidizing the private sector to get involved or to open opportunities in new competitive advantage. Actually, at the local level, the state, and this, by the way, is now the state of the current research, is to focus at the local level on cities and economic zones around cities and local communities in order to enhance the productivity and the job creation in localities. And then nationally, is to look at the frontier of technology. How, for example, universities, like, for example, the American University of Beirut, or American University of Cairo, or Sharjah, American University of Sharjah, or any other lead university, to actually develop the capacity, research capacity, in order to link with international laboratories and to try to relocalize technology and to build supply chain and value chain and so on. So this would be a very important role for the state, and also will provide a role for the private sector and provide the private sector more space. But then it is very important that the whole thing will be a new strategy of deliberative cooperation and learning by doing, and mixed strategy of focusing on localities. For example, I don't want to take too much time, but I just wanted to cite an example of the disparity, since we are talking about inclusive growth, between the seafront regions of the Middle East, like Egypt and Tunisia, and the southern part of these countries, or the hinterland part of these countries. You will see that actually, despite the climate change and the sea level rise that is going to be challenging for these two countries, Egypt and Tunisia, the concentration of infrastructure and economic activity is in the front line, in the seafront states or regions or provinces, while the hinterland is actually left out from development. And so this will be, for example, one role for the state, is to try to think especially about design of development policy. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Before we proceed with Dr. Lina and talking about the woman's role in inclusive growth, I would just like to take the discussion point that you brought up and take it to Dr. Jaidi. He's talking about the role of the state. We're talking about the widening of the social protection systems as being one of the pillars in the role of the state at this point. So it's more about designing policies, setting the laws, setting the regulations, rather than leading the business of certain sectors. How can we talk about this from the Moroccan perspective? Morocco has had several reforms over the past decade. They have helped in improving the economic growth, yet still there are a lot of hurdles, a lot of obstacles that still face the Moroccan economy. How can we link what we've just discussed to the Moroccan economy?
Thank you. I agree with you that Morocco has launched an ambitious series of reforms. And if we have to learn some lessons from this dynamic, I think that it will be more interesting to focus on the implementation of some reforms in some areas or sectors than to discuss the process of reform as a whole. And I will choose 4 or 5 areas of reforms that will be interesting for others. The first is the management of public finance. I think that public finance reform is important for modernizing the state and for more transparency, for more effective and efficient policy and public policies. In order to achieve these ambitious goals, Morocco chose to set up a performance and program-based budgeting system. And this reform launched the transition from a classification based on the nature of the expenditure to a classification on based on destination of the expenditure. And the reform established an accountability approach. An accountability approach of government administration, allowing a manager to have more flexibility and to attain their objectives. But there are some challenges to the operationalization of this reform. First, we have several public policy. They have been grouped into single program or budget programs to avoid fragmentation and allow budget managers to have some fiscal space. And the second is that the departments began developing performance indicators. And the third is the public institutions are invited to adopt the similar approach that the states, that the budget states. We have some lessons from this experience. I think that the full implementation of these reforms show that there is a real involvement of the result-based culture within the administration, but there is still much room for improvement this reform. There is a need for a performance platform or framework at the level of decentralization in the region. And the functions and organizational structures of ministers should gradually evolve to ensure their consistency with the budget program. And the third is from political perspective, there is a need to reinforce or strengthen the stakeholder of this policies. I mean parliament, civil society, trade unions, and so on. The second experience, which is interested for the rest of the countries in the MENA, is the industrial policy of Morocco. To encourage the structural transformation of the industry in Morocco and to look for a wider growth in this sector, the government introduced a new industrial policy. It's named the National Pact of Industrial Emergence. And following this plan, there is another plan for accelerated the process of the transformation of structural industry. And the success of these two panels derive in large part from the development of ecosystems. It is clusters on in some sectors, connected sectors, to have a development of interrelation branch or sectors development in this industry. The third lesson, I think, is on energy transition and renewable energies. I think that Morocco has made a name in itself as a climate leader in this sector. The other experience, I think, is the advanced regionalization. Morocco has implemented since 2015 the advanced regionalization reform, which gives the elected regions greater competence in terms of economic development and additional financial and human resources. The regions become a partner of the government for territorial development. And we know that 60% of Morocco live in urban areas. And the issues of concern in the 8 important cities in Morocco are economic development and inclusion and environmental sustainability. And the link between urban and rural development are a main objective of this reform. And this reform has met many challenges. The first is to strengthen the effectiveness of reform. The second is to improve the governance of public local investment. And the third challenge is a better coordination between public and public action between the central administration and the region. And the last but not least experience is on the reform of the social protection system in Morocco. I think that in Morocco we have the subsystems of Morocco social protection have been developed in a fragmented manner and in a long period. And today, Morocco social protection system consists of a social security system that is contributory, and a partial contributory social protection system, and the no-contributory social protection. But this system has not a single objective and a single institutional organization. So Morocco is now seizing the opportunity to reboot its social protection instruments in order to make them more effective, more integrated.
Thank you, Dr. Jaidi. Before we finalize this panel, I would like to speak last but not least with Dr. Lina. You are the only woman on this esteemed panel, and that's why we will finalize this discussion with you. I will say this cliche phrase, المرأة نصف المجتمع, women make half the society, and the inclusion of women in development and the development model for economies is crucial. How can we assess the role of women so far in the MENA region? Where are the gaps? Where are the opportunities? What can be done to improve their participation in the labor force, participation in the economy?
Thank you. Yeah, when it comes to women, I have a lot to say. I'm going to be very brief. The first thing I will say is it's not enough to have policies directed at women. It's important to do that because in a lot of contexts like rural settings, you need policies that take into consideration the specificities of the disadvantages that often, sadly, women encounter in such contexts. But that's not enough. Very often, this is all we see. Program for women empowerment, and then the policymakers pat themselves on the back. What you need as well is actually to integrate the participation of women at every level of decision-making and every project in every platform in a meaningful way and not a tokenistic way. And sadly, I must say, with all due respect to my host, but finding myself on a panel with 4 men, a woman moderator, with all due respect, is not the same as inviting a woman to speak because, you know, it's not enough to just have a woman moderator. You also need women to speak. And there are many brilliant women who are experts on these topics today who could join us, you know. So just the 2 of us, I feel we don't represent the wide scope of talent that exists in this region. And yet, very often, the participation of women is an afterthought. And trust me, I've been on so many panels where I know I'm only being invited because of someone thinking we need a woman on this panel. And yeah, I still come because I think it's important. At least it's a platform for me to make these kinds of critiques. So have women be involved in the decision-making process, not just at the receiving side of the projects, and not just projects that are meant to be for women. And I would say the same about youth. That's another category that really irritates me, Because again, it's as if youth exist in a separate society, not connected to the wider society. So you have youth empowerment projects and programs. Again, important. I'm not saying do without them, but it's not enough. How do you empower youth? Have them on panels like this. Have them in projects about solutions. They have a lot to offer. I'm very impressed with the young people in this region, I have to say. And the way I would empower them is just to engage them just like everybody else in top-level conversations. The problem, again, goes back to trust. We, in general, in this kind of high-level policy analysis and policy-making world, sometimes think that we know best. And this has to do with institutional design and institutional culture, which is a problem in the region. The prevalent kind of institutions we have is what are called push institutions, not pull institutions. What are push institutions? These are institutions that tend to be quite centralized, quite bureaucratic, based on command and control, based on we tightly hold faith in our own thinking. We don't quite want to put faith in flows of knowledge. These kinds of institutional kind of norms act as unconscious bias. So even with our best intentions, when we have these kinds of institutions in place, we are automatically limiting how much innovation there can be to design solutions for such as inclusive growth and other issues. What we need instead are what are called pull institutions, that are the institutions that bring the talent towards them, give them a platform for expression, recognizing that actually innovation comes from collaboration and inclusion in a very a kind of mobilized way. And so you have women obviously being part of this milieu that I'm talking about, the mobilized citizens who are giving solutions and taking part in the design of solutions, and not the receiving side of things that are designed by the intellectual elites that are actually closed-minded. Thank you.
I want to ask you something about this point, Dr. Lina. Are you pro the quotas in institutions, whether public and private, when it comes to women, or would this increase the fragmentation between the two genders? If we talk about having quotas, whether in parliaments, in board of governors, and central banks, and all the public institutions that have a crucial role in decision-making, whether on the political front or the economic front?
To be honest, the solution is not really about quotas or the lack of them, just like the solution in inclusive governance, for example, is not about federalism or decentralization versus centralization. You can have inclusion no matter what model you implement when you are being equitable in the way you engage with your citizens, and when the policies are truly collaborative in terms of their design and all the issues that my colleagues and I have talked about today. So it's not about quotas. Quotas can work, but they also can do very little difference if they are just cosmetic quotas, just fill positions with women that are not qualified, which actually ends up hurting the cause, because then a lot of people say, look, we put a woman in this high-level position, and look what happened. It's a disaster. Well, that's because you didn't put a qualified woman in that position. You just ticked the gender box without looking at the merit that should come with that. So just quotas on their own is not going to be enough. You need to have genuine inclusion for us to really have progress.
Thank you, Dr. Lina, but we have to mention that we have also really a successful women in the Arab world in leading positions. Specifically, if I want to talk about several ministers in the Egyptian government, even in the Lebanese government, in many governments, we've had some successful women, but as you've just said, it has to be on a bigger scale. Thank you, everyone, for this discussion. Now, we will open the room for questions and answers. Anyone would like to discuss anything? All right, I will pass the microphone. You have? All right, excellent.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'm Saïda Hjaji, a research economist in Central Bank. I have a question. I don't know if there is an answer of my question, but we will see. So it's about financial inclusion. My question is what we are missing now, because it's not lack of infrastructure or products, but we still facing challenges. We cannot include all the people in terms of gender, young people, poor people. So what we are missing now? That's what my question.
Is your question directed at one of the...
No, it's
who would
open.
like to
It's
answer
open.
this question? Okay, we'll take another question and then we could have two answers. Please go ahead.
Just thank you very much. My name is Lahsan Haddad. I'm a university professor, but also researcher. The question of governance came all over the different discussions, and I think it's a right kind of theme that needs to be there. But we need to nuance the question of governance in the Arab world. It's quite a diverse kind of region. One of the paradoxes actually is like there are authoritarian regimes, but with inclusive growth. If you think, for example, about the Gulf countries, that they have that kind of thing. And some of them, it's not only about rent economy, some of them are successfully moving out of the rent economy, but they're still inclusive, but at the same time, they're politically closed. And the role of the state is very strong. So that's a paradox we need to analyze, and that's a different kind of story. But there are also post-authoritarian countries which are still like authoritarian, but there is some sort of openness, there is some sort of democracy, relative in a sense, and different kinds of phases of openness and all of that. That's where there is like big thing. Like that's Egypt, that's Morocco, that's Jordan, that's Tunisia, and all of the other countries. And I think that's where there is a lot to be done in terms of like the reforms and then relation to the political system. And I think the kind of openness that we're talking about is there, but it happens. Where there are other countries, I think there are two other categories, purely autocratic countries with less reforms and all of that, and we know that. We should not name them here, but they exist, and the failed kind of regime. So I think the question of governance, if we want to really target and then see what kind of solution we have, we need to nuance it in that kind of situation and then contextualize. The second question, and I finish here, is the paradox of the middle class, and it has been talked about by the different panelists, is that the middle class pays taxes, but for the services rendered by the state, they are poor, and therefore it finds itself like obliged to go and then find those kinds of services in privatized education, privatized health, and privatized whatever. So I think that's the real bind and the real trap that we need to talk about. Like, how can you empower the middle class because it's provider of resources and taxes, and at the same time provide those kinds of services that they need, and that if we answer that kind of question, I think we can have a better role for the middle class. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got three questions here. One about the financial inclusion of the different sectors or sects of society. And we have a question about the governance and the nature of the political systems in the MENA region, and the empowering of the middle class, given that they provide resources through the taxation and the taxes that they pay, yet sometimes the services that the state has to provide are not inclusive of all the services needed, and hence the need for the private sector. So who would like to answer?
I'm happy to say something about financial inclusion, perhaps, if that's all right.
Please, of course, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. It's a very important issue, with all the efforts that have been done everywhere in the MENA region on improving financial inclusions, and the numbers are actually not bad. There has been a growth in number of people with bank accounts, with credit cards, with access to postal services, banking services, and so on. All very good. But the question is why not more? Why isn't it producing the impact that is needed. And here I also say something very specific, which is that focusing on financial inclusion has been very much on banking procedures, on know your customer rules, on use of technology to get e-signatures. All of this is very good. And it allows people better access to financial services, no doubt about it. But the real driver for all of this, the next step, or perhaps the parallel step, should have been to ask ourselves, what is the inclusion in the economic activity? You know, you're opening a bank account to do what? You're issuing a credit card to do what? What is your level of participation in the economy? How open is this and how closed? My point is that if we want to encourage more financial inclusion, I think the next step is to encourage more economic participation in the actual activities that will require the financial system to be used. So the emphasis now, and should have been, but certainly must be now, how to improve women's access to opportunities, economic opportunities, selling, buying, participating in tenders, whether big or small. Same thing for the youth. Perhaps women are more integrated in informal financial systems. What do we do about this? So it's really about encouraging people to have an economic role, not just to be able to open a bank account in 5 minutes and then basically not have much to do with it. And the other thing is that we must recognize that there is no necessary competition between formal finance and informal finance. One will grow with time, one will diminish with time, but people will continue to have a foot here and a foot there for a transitionary period, maybe forever. So we should, again, not be obsessed about improving the number of people, especially women and youth, in financial services, but what economic opportunities are there to encourage them to take up those financial activities.
Yes, please go ahead. The question about empowering the middle class.
Yeah, I mean, I took the question to be about actually the role of democracy and whether it's an essential component for inclusive growth. I mean, the argument presented is sometimes you can have a degree of inclusive growth even if you have autocracy. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the work of Pippa Norris. She wrote this book, for those of you who are not familiar, called Making Democratic Governance Work, How Regimes Shape Prosperity, Welfare, and Peace. And I mean, I have some critiques of her work, but I find one of the arguments she makes in the book quite compelling. The book basically lists what you've basically laid out in terms of, do you really need liberal democracy for there to be effective development? And there are some examples like Singapore, for example, where you have strong state capacity, but not really much democracy. And yet you do have, you know, relatively effective development, and then other settings that you've mentioned. What she says is, if you have liberal democracy without state capacity, you end up undermining liberal democratic principles, because then the state won't be able to deliver. So it's not enough to have democracy. You definitely need strong state capacity. And sometimes, yes, you can have strong state capacity even if you don't have liberal democracy, and you can have results. However, the key argument here is there a limit? Is there a limit in this kind of setting to how much effectiveness there can be? And this is where I agree with her, which is actually you need both. If you're really going to have real inclusion, if you're really going to have effective development that does not have a ceiling, that's constantly innovating, constantly finding solutions to emerging crises, then you need to work on both tracks. So what you're saying holds. However, I think we can do even better by opening up space for accountability, for good governance, and all those other principles. And I think, you know, we shouldn't hide behind state capacity in order to say, but we don't need democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rina. Dr. Bahout would like to answer
Yeah.
the second question.
Yes, not exactly answer. In fact, I would like to push forward a little bit. I find your, I mean, all of your remarks really fascinating and very important, and they push us, in fact, towards what is happening today on the global scene. Exactly in line with what Lina has said. I mean, this articulation between democracy, free markets, growth, etc. What I alluded to in my first intervention is something I engage really, and I urge institutions like the IMF and others to look at. I mean, let's talk really, I mean, international politics. These institutions are, I mean, the Bretton Woods family is born at the age of the victory of the liberal order. The world today, this order is challenged. Let's face it, okay? It's challenged by China, it's challenged by others, by neo-authoritarian regimes, by illiberal democracies, as you said, gray zones of democracy and etc. And some of them are really performing well on the economic level. And this is where I think the question of the limit, Pippa Norris and etc. is interesting. Of course, democracy provides more flexibility, more responsiveness capacity to crises and etc. But also we have to face that not only the performance level of these illiberal democracies or some authoritarian regimes is good, and we have to acknowledge it, but more than that, and this is where I think the fundamental question, these regimes or these actors on the international scene are increasingly questioning the philosophical underpinning of this liberal world order and the institutions that it has created. I'm not sure, and we were talking in the bus bringing us to here with Professor de Boissieu, for example, and he was telling me he's working on de-dollarization and etc. All this order is today, I wouldn't say collapsing or unraveling, but it is seriously challenged. The predominance of the dollar, the predominance of the philosophical underpinnings of institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, the philosophical underpinnings of this nexus between political liberalism and economic growth and liberalization is put under stress and under challenge. We have to see it, we have to look at it, and we have probably, and I'm talking here from an academic point of view, we have to start probably looking for new intellectual, academic, conceptual tools in order to understand that. I leave the question of challenging it or not. This is an activism question, but at least on the academic level, we need probably to refine certain of our analytical tools. A quick word on the question of the middle class, which also I find fascinating. I'm not very much into the figures and etc. But my feeling is that in most of the countries that are living today the most acute crises in the MENA region, I put aside the Gulf, where probably there is the illusion of creating a new middle class, a little bit like in the 70s with the oil rent then, but today it's mainly centered on leisure, on probably service economy, the MBS model and etc. I leave this aside. But in most of the countries that are living today acute crises like Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon and etc., what we are witnessing is a complete erosion of the middle class and the growing polarization between a very, let's say, internationalized rich class and upper class, which is 2% maybe of the distribution, and a very wide and increasingly impoverished segment of the population, which is outside the financial circuit, and here we get back to Dr. Bahauddin's question and etc., or even outside, let's say, the social norm. It's increasingly living in apathy, in clusters, in isolation, and this is for me, as a political scientist, the most important challenge and fear that I derive from the political economy that is growing in the Middle East.
Thank you, Dr. Bahout, for this comprehensive answer and discussion. Any questions? Please, go ahead. The gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Badr Jawari. I'm a second year undergraduate student at the FGCS, and I've been enjoying the discussion so far. I would like to thank the respected speakers for sharing with us such insightful ideas. And I would also like to extend the thanks to the Policy Center for the New South and the IMF for organizing and inviting us to this event. My question regarding this topic is the following. Is economic growth always related to adopting certain values? And to be more precise, while we question the failure of some economic reforms that were implemented in the MENA region, can't we also focus and question the way these reforms were implemented in the region, and how can we adopt economic reforms to the culture and the values of people who live in the MENA region, and not just copying other economic models that were successful in certain other regions? Thank you.
Very insightful question. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted actually to follow up on Dr. Ziad's point about financial inclusion, to suggest that really the essence of the crisis in our region is that the elephant in the room is the macroeconomy. When you have exorbitant interest rate like the one we see in most countries, access to finance become very prohibitive from a macroeconomic perspective. But I also think that, so it is very important that to go back to the basics, what we really need is to have a viable fiscal policy, increase the fiscal effort to levels that, like 30% of GDP, at least high 20s of GDP, and also to ensure that, the fiscal dominance of monetary policy, that the Ministry of Finance provide lending and the banking sector. The extreme case is of course Lebanon, but there are variation of the themes. So that's very important. The second thing I think is, since we are hosted by the Policy Center for the New South, is just to share with you the experience of Kenya, the Republic of Kenya in sub-Saharan Africa. Digital transfers of money, mobile money, has actually generated considerable data of SMEs, and including women-led, micro enterprises and medium scale enterprises. And there are now 3 companies in Nairobi who are actually analyzing big data, mostly for informal SMEs to banking sector, that actually do not, the main reason why the banking sector are not lending to the micro and SMEs, because of the lack of collateral and also lack of credit record. So this is an experience that I think is quite important for us to think about in terms of the financial inclusion. Finally, I would like to say something about governance and development. I fully agree with Lena's point that you need to have a capable state. But on the other, and therefore, so you have a state that actually can actually deliver development. But how could that happen? I think in our region, you either have a dysfunctional liberal democracy, which is, of course, almost extinct, but you mainly have authoritarian that are not committed to development, or they are committed to development in an erroneous way that does not open up opportunities for national debate and discussions and so on. So I think what is needed is that we need a democracy, but a democracy that's also accountable economically. There is not only electoral democracy, but economic legitimacy. And I think a discussion and a debate about this would be very critical, because in my opinion, because of the diversity of many societies in our region, take the case of Lebanon or Sudan, for example, authoritarian regime will never survive there. So you have to have a democracy. But then if you have a democracy that is not developmental, then that's a blueprint for failure. So I think that's a dimension that would be, I would like just to share with the meeting for future discussion and future research in our region. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your clarification and the discussion that we've had today. I would like to thank you all for attending this panel discussion. Thank you for our esteemed panelists. Thank you for those who are joining us virtually. And I hope the discussion was fruitful for everybody and intriguing and mind-opening. Thank you, everybody.